Welcome to the final round of Big Questions Debate, supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. Thanks to the generosity of the John Templeton Foundation, the National Speech and Debate Association has given almost $1.5 million to speech and debate programs across the country since 2016. Let's introduce our esteemed panel of judges for this final round of Big Questions Debate. Afra Abdullah from California. Antonio Bales from Kansas. Donald Broussard from Louisiana. Robert Dolan from Florida. Clover Ellingson from North Dakota. NSDA board member Adam Jacoby from Wisconsin. NSDA board member Jay Rye from Alabama. Sarah Sanchez from Illinois. And Lisa Weber from Washington.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Tim. We are about to start the final round of Big Questions Debate, which will feature a side-locked round as these competitors met in round 6, our final prelim. So going at it again, on the affirmative this time, code 47. And on the negative, code 39. And with that, I will leave you to this fine esteemed panel and a great round. Good luck to both.
To start with, I have not yet received your case to my opponent, so I was wondering if you were planning on sending that or not for evidence exchange purposes.
My email says it delivered 4 minutes ago. I can try sending again.
Okay, I guess in the meantime, I'll deliver my thanking remarks, I guess. So first, I would like to thank the National Speech and Debate Association and all of its members for making this tournament and countless other opportunities possible this year, especially with all the obstacles that the past year has thrown at us. The work and effort put in by all of the staff, both behind and in front of the scenes, is even more impressive and all the more meaningful. Secondly, thank you to the John Templeton Foundation for their generous support in helping young people answer the big questions of our world. Thirdly, thank you to all of the incredible judges who have taken time out of their busy lives for the sake of their belief in speech and debate and its power to make the world a better place. Without your time and commitment, this wouldn't be possible. In that vein, I would also like to thank my amazing and inspiring competitors, whether we chatted, texted, or messaged after or before the round. I'm so grateful I had the chance to meet every one of you. Each of you helped restore that sense of community that I've been so dearly missing this year. Fourthly, I'd like to extend my thanks to all of my past and present teammates who taught me so much throughout the years, cheering for me at my high points and helping me learn and improve at my low. Finally, I would also like to thank the members of my local debate community, to Ms. Tanya Roundy, who sat through so many emails to help me get signed up for national qualifiers when there was a miscommunication, to Dr. C, my past debate coach, who taught me so much more than just debate, and to my school administration, thank you for your support, and I hope you will continue choosing to value our debate program in the future, and to everyone else who has taught me something along the way, thank you so, so much for helping me get here. And then I will see if I have received the negative case. Okay, I have gotten your case now. Wait, hold up. Okay, now I have your case. Okay, I am ready to go as long as everyone else is ready. Okay, then with all those thumbs up, I'll be beginning my first speech now. I have had my results for a long time, but I do not yet know how I am to arrive at them. Carl Friedrich Gauss, a famed mathematician, once said this of mathematics. The ultimate result of math has always been around us. Everything we see, hear, and touch, the physical aspects of our entire universe, follow mathematical principles. The real struggle is our own discovery of that math. Math is the rules by which our universe functions, and we are simply observing those rules. Due to this, I affirm, resolved, mathematics was discovered, not invented. To offer clarity for this debate, I present the following definitions. According to Cambridge English Dictionary, mathematics is the science of numbers, forms, amounts, and their relationships. Discover is defined as to find something that had not been known before, and invent is defined as to design and or create something that has never been made before. Contention 1. Mathematic principles are independent of humans. Ultimately, mathematics is a combination of all of the basic rules that govern our universe. Kaku 2010 explains, math is discovered to be invented requires an inventor, but math exists outside of humanity, end quote. The independent nature of mathematics is fairly easy to observe. For example, if I had 5 apples and Sally gave me another 5, I'd then have 10 apples. This is some basic math. 5 plus 5 equals 10. Regardless of what you call these numbers or whether you understand them, the mathematical principles of this situation are consistent. Additionally, for example, even if a 2-year-old doesn't understand that 5 plus 5 is 10 and not 8 or 3 or 4, that doesn't change the fact that 5 plus 5 is in fact 10. From this example, it's clear that no single person invented the notion that 5 plus 5 is 10. It was discovered. Hold up your 5 fingers on one hand and your 5 fingers on the other, and you too can discover the universal notion that 5 plus 5 equals 10. Math requires no inventor to simply exist. Contention 2, mathematical language. The difference between mathematics and mathematical language is why math is discovered while mathematical symbols and models are invented. You might find yourself wondering now, sure, 5 plus 5 equals 10, but what about the worlds of calculus, complex algebra, and all those other letters and symbols I just suffered through in high school? Those seem invented. The explanation for this, though, is that there is, in fact, a distinction between mathematical language and mathematics itself, just as is the case with practically anything else. An appropriate analogy would be, say, the naming of a bird. The word itself, bird, is a human invention. The word is a tool we use in order to communicate the larger concept of feathered bipedal creature. You could just as easily call it a oiseau in French or a niao in Chinese, but just because we invented the language to represent such a creature doesn't mean we invented birds themselves. Similarly, just because we've invented certain ways to represent mathematical concepts doesn't mean we've invented mathematics itself. Lakoff and Nunez, 2000. Mathematics is seen as the epitome of precision manifested in the use of symbols and calculation and informal proofs. Symbols are, of course, just symbols, not ideas. The intellectual content of mathematics lies in its ideas, not in the symbols themselves, end quote. Mathematical language and modeling is a human invention, while mathematics itself is not. Like how a telescope we use to see the moon more clearly is an invention, but the moon itself is not. Returning to the previous example, we can represent 5 plus 5 equals 10 in a variety of ways, such as a graph, a diagram, a matrix, or an equation. We can use Arabic numerals, Roman numerals, or even our own fingers. The mathematical language we use to describe 5 plus 5 changes because it's dependent on humans, but the concept behind it, the true math behind it, is consistent and universal. Contention 3. The way mathematics is expanded through further exploration is evidence of its discoverability. Vermont's last theorem is an example of how mathematics is discovered, not invented. Vermont made the observation that a to the n plus b to the n would never equal c to the n. Only 500 years later was the proof for this theorem found by Andrew Wiles, a professor at Oxford University. If math were truly invented, this sort of additional discovery would not have been possible. In essence, Andrew Wiles added nothing tangible to the original theorem, only the discovery of supplemental knowledge. If Vermont had invented the theorem, you would say a to the n plus b to the n never equals c to the n because Vermont said so, and that would be the end of it. The reason additional discovery and proof exists is because Vermont didn't invent the concept behind a to the n plus b to the n. He only observed it. In this way, further observations were able to occur centuries after his death, the same way humans can study the moon century after century without inventing anything new about the moon. A second example of this connected nature of math can be found in Einstein's general theory of relativity, which included concepts that Bernard Riemann had discovered decades before. Gribben in 2016 explains, although Riemann's extension of geometry was the most important feature of his lecture, the most astonishing with hindsight was his suggestion that space might be curved into a closed ball more than half a century before Einstein came up with the general theory of relativity, end quote. Riemann could never have imagined at the time of his discovery that his mathematical work would later be proven true by Einstein, who would later be proven true by real-world observations of black holes. This ultimate reliance upon provability and observation, as demonstrated by these two separate examples and countless others, is what makes math ultimately discovered and not invented. And for these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
Before I begin, I'd like to echo the affirmative in extending some thank yous. First of all, thank you to the John Templeton Foundation for its generous support of Big Questions debate. I found BQ to be unique because of how it contrasts with other events, not just in terms of the issues it discusses, but also the format and the resulting strategy and everything else. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time debating BQ. Thank you to the NSDA for hosting an excellent national tournament, as well as a very engaging environment around debate in general. For me personally, debate has been the greatest avenue for personal growth over the past several years. Thank you to the BQ tab staff and judges. I've seen all the excitement and organization that goes behind making this tournament work. Also, it's been almost a week of running around, so thank you for all of that. Thank you to my teammates. You've all been a wonderful social outlet, as well as very supportive, including my late night rants about mathematics. And not just teammates too, but everyone outside of my team that's been supportive. Cade and Paxton for practice rounds, everyone else from Idaho who's just been supportive in general, Talon, Titan, Naruna, Avi, Casey, the list goes on and on and on. Next, thank you to my coaches. I've had coaches cycle out through the years, but thank you to Petty for first developing my interest in debate and all my growth that ensued from it. Thank you to Shummy for being so supportive and helpful. I definitely grew the most my sophomore year. Thank you to RJ for helping me get re-interested in debate. You're so easy to talk to and get help with. You literally walked around with me just outside to tell me calm down prior to this round. Also turned this nationals tournament into not just a tournament, but an adventure, something that's been really fun. Also, thank you to Brock. Not only are you very well versed in phrasing and strategy and just giving help to kids who need it, but also you have an amazing beard. It is luscious, and I am jealous. Finally, thank you to my parents for being so supportive. Without further ado, can I get thumbs up from everyone when you're all ready? And I will begin the negative constructive. And negate and note the following definitions. Mathematics is loosely defined by the American Heritage Dictionary as the study of the measurement, properties, and relationships of quantities and sets using numbers and symbols. Discover is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as find unexpectedly or in the course of a search, and invent is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as create or design something that has not existed before, be the originator of. A very simple but useful mechanism for determining this finding versus creating is a thought experiment. Would mathematics exist if sentient beings were not present? If so, math has to be discovered. If not, it's likely invented. This is an equal and accessible burden for both sides. My first contention is the disconnected nature of mathematics, starting with an application of intuition. If you would zoom in on the flesh of your hand, you won't see little squiggly equations. What you will see is merely what our equations in biology are designed to represent: cell walls, proteins, lipids, and the relations thereof. This is a subtle yet crucial difference, because representation is at odds with physical existence. It's the difference between a textbook diagram of an atom and the physical atom itself. Math is more so the diagram. There's two additional justifications for this view. The first of which is approximation. As Professor Abbott, with a PhD in physics at the University of Adelaide, writes, all mathematical models are approximations of reality. Consider, for instance, Newton's equations of gravity. No one on Earth would dispute that this is math at perhaps its finest, and yet it's an approximation, one that was further refined through Einstein's developments on relativity. At a certain point, say at a certain level of decimal precision, that math is no longer correct. It's out of touch with reality. It's close, but it's not real in any sense of the word. You can't discover these approximations because they're not out there in reality for us to discover. Math is thus a human tool designed to meet a uniquely human need. And just like we've abandoned other tools when our species outgrew them, the sling, the basket, the club, so too we've abandoned mathematical tools that have outgrown their purpose. From Kepler to Newton to Einstein, our tools certainly get better, but they're still just tools. Second, math that has no physical analog. For a simple example, consider the concept of smallness. From a length perspective, the universe has a smallest unit known as the Planck distance. Siegel 19 writes, below about 10 to the negative 35 meters, the Planck distance, our laws only give nonsense. It's an interesting little physics tidbit, but note how you and I and anyone else can quite literally fabricate the numbers 10 to the negative 36, or 10 to the negative 100ths, or even 10 to the negative 1000ths. We can add and multiply and exponentiate these physically unreal numbers. Therefore, what constrains the universe does not constrain our notion of mathematics. Similar arguments apply for length, infinity, continuity, and almost all of our modern math. If you open up a recently published math journal, you'll find topics like computation theory, set theory, and number theory. Those topics have no direct connection to physical reality. They are by definition inventions. As German mathematician Leopold Kronecker succinctly puts it, God created the integers, but all else is the work of man. My second contention is the uniqueness of awareness. Perhaps humanity's greatest strength is its capacity for awareness and reflection. We serve as a viewpoint for the world, and math as an entire field only exists inside that viewpoint. But let's break down that claim. The first issue is awareness. Nature is a rather drab entity that takes no assumptions and makes no stipulations. It simply is. That's why if one piece of driftwood floating on a pond hits another piece, it isn't magically 1 + 1 = 2. There's no one to say what 1 means, what plus means, or what equals means. Humans serve as the window of awareness and reference, and thus our mathematics only exists inside of that window. While this example is about the basis of our arithmetic, the argument extends to everything from logical inference and proof to the most advanced developments on quantum mechanics. As an analogy, consider how nooks and crannies that hold water clearly exist out in nature, and yet the water bottle is very clearly a human invention. Without our awareness, assumptions, and very existence, math as we know it would not exist. The second issue is invented context. Math is only true within respective contexts. For example, 1 + 1 = 2 is only true in the context of the base 10 numerical system. There's no floating entity in the cosmos that stipulates that 1 + 1 must always equal 2. In fact, our microchips, on the fundamental level, run on single-unit truth-based binary, and in that context, 1 + 1 = 1. But most astounding of all, it's us humans that have stipulated that. Therefore, all of our specialized mathematics that runs on the computer in front of you, for example, the encoding, compressing, and decompression algorithms this video feed goes through, is all invented. Since context makes certain math true or false, and we quite literally invent new contexts, such as computation, mathematics itself must be invented. Therefore, due to the disconnected nature of mathematics and the uniqueness of human awareness, I urge you to negate, and I'm open for cross-examination.
Okay, crossfire. May I have the first question?
Yeah, just 1 second. All right, yeah, go ahead.
Then I'll start the time now. So my first question is about your definitions. The two of your definitions are from Oxford Dictionary, but your first one's from the American Heritage Dictionary. Is there any reason why you picked specifically the American Heritage Dictionary for your definition of math?
I mean, I just thought it was clearer. I mean, the Oxford one is similar.
Okay, do you have the Oxford one available by chance?
I believe it's the abstract science of number, quantity, and space.
Okay, just clarifying. Would you like the next question?
Yeah. At the end of your speech, you mentioned how Einstein's theory drew on mathematics developed earlier. Now, is this unique to discovery, or does it also apply to invention? Say if I'm trying to invent a bicycle, I might draw on inventions like the wheel, would I not?
This is pretty different. It's the exact reason why I gave the Fermat example first. So with the Fermat example, Andrew Wiles created nothing when he added more information and knowledge. He didn't create anything new. If you were to read Andrew Wiles' work and Fermat's work, you'd similarly get from both of them that a to the n plus b to the n never will equal c to the n. So he added nothing. So even with the example of the Einstein one that you just inquired about, with Einstein and Riemann discovered a concept and Einstein's work proved that concept true. It didn't add anything on top of that. And the thing that ultimately proved both of their work true was real-world observation of black hole. So it wasn't like the addition of, say, a carriage to a wheel. There was nothing added. The only thing was more discovery of extra knowledge. There was nothing actually tangible added to either of these situations.
Could I have a follow-up?
Of course.
Starting on the claim about Wiles' proof of Fermat's last theorem. Say if Wiles had never existed, this proof would have never existed. That proof is like 700 pages long. Is that not mathematics?
That proof is simply another representation of mathematics, like look to my second contention. But this representation of those mathematics is something different from the true mathematics themselves. We're talking about mathematics as the actual concepts. So that proof that he wrote, sure, that was a human invention. But the fact of the matter is that a to the n plus b to the n never equaling c to the n, that theorem was true regardless of whether or not Andrew Wiles had written that proof. So that proof wasn't necessary to the actual truth of the universe.
Can we know that if the proof never existed?
Well, that's the entire point of it. Things like the fact of the matter is that mathematics doesn't depend on whether or not we know about it. Before Fermat even discovered that theorem, that was still true about our universe. So when we're looking to this idea of discovery, the question that you put in your own framework of whether or not it would still exist if sentient beings were not present, if there was nobody to know about this math would still exist. It required nobody to know about it, nobody to actually conceptualize it for it to simply exist out there in the universe.
All right.
I guess, may I have another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in your second contention, you have two subpoints, correct? And I wasn't exactly sure how those two differed or whether or not they were still just kind of the same idea of how humans stipulate these numerical numbers and symbols.
Well, the first is that we provide awareness for pre-existent contexts out in the universe. The second is that we fundamentally invent new contexts.
Okay, I'm gonna get a drink of water and then I'll start my prep time. Okay, I'll be using some running prep time starting now. Okay, that was a minute used, and then for a brief off-time roadmap, this is going to resemble pretty standard line by line. I'm just going to go down the negative case. If I have any time left over, I'll be going over the general concepts of this round. If everyone is ready, then time will start now. So starting off with the sort of framework of this debate, starting with the definition of mathematics itself. During cross-examination, I asked my opponent why he chose the American Heritage Dictionary definition, and he said that it was like pretty arbitrary, he just thought it was clear. But when we're actually looking to the definitions from Cambridge, Merriam-Webster, and Oxford, all three of these different dictionaries, they all define mathematics as a science. Science is defined by Cambridge Dictionary as knowledge from the careful study of the physical world. Merriam-Webster similarly defines science as knowledge. Oxford also defines science as this sort of systematic study of the physical world. So when we're looking to these definitions of mathematics, we ultimately see that mathematics is about this sort of knowledge, this sort of things that we learn about the world. It's something that we discover out there in the world. It's not something that we just invent. It's not the notation. There's a difference between mathematical notation, mathematical language, and mathematics itself. Now moving on to my opponent's case, starting with their first contention. Their first contention is pretty much about how it's disconnected from nature, with their first point being that all models are an approximation. But the thing is, when we're looking to this whole idea of models being an approximation, yes, they're an approximation because those models are an invention. But the mathematical principles at the end of the day, those are the things that stay consistent and universal. Look to my Lakoff-Nunez card that I read in my second contention. This pretty much explains that those models are not the same thing as mathematics itself. We looked at the example of, say, the telescope metaphor, that our telescopes have gotten better and better over the years. We have seen the moon more clearly and more clearly over the years. But that doesn't mean that suddenly we invented the moon. We invented that telescope, but we didn't invent the moon itself. Likewise, our models have gotten closer and closer, but that doesn't mean that we suddenly invented those concepts behind those models. Moving on to the idea that there's no physical analog for a lot of these concepts, but we see that this simply isn't the case. We look to even the example that he gave of 10 to the negative 36. 10 to the negative 36, that's something you could observe if you were to define that, say, this is 1. Then 10 to the negative 36 would be like this tiny fraction of this pen. It's something that you actually are able to see in the real world. These quantities exist in the real world. For example, if I were to throw this pen suddenly, it's not going to suddenly start going up or sideways or down. It's going to travel in this parabolic path. That's the path that mathematics describes. Moving on to my opponent's second contention. So my opponent's second contention is pretty much about this uniqueness of awareness, that humans have to be aware of math for math to exist. But we look to the idea that I brought up in my second contention, that the idea of naming a bird, for example. When we first discovered the red-winged blackbird, we named it the red-winged blackbird. We invented that name for it. We may have invented the word red-winged blackbird, but it doesn't mean that we invented the bird itself. Likewise, with my opponent's example of what 1 + 1 = 2 means, we may have defined what like the number 1 is. We could have used like our fingers instead, or we could have used Roman numerals instead of whatever Arabic numerals, or different. We could have said 1 star 1 lambda 2. It doesn't matter what we're saying. We might have invented those symbols, but the mathematical principles of it are going to stay consistent. In no world is ever 1 + 1 going to equal anything other than 2. That would mean that I would hold up one finger, hold up another finger, and suddenly have a different amount of fingers showing. So this objectivity is the reason why this falls apart. This brings me to the second point that goes against their second contention, this idea of objectivity. If humans just purely invented math like my opponent suggests, then we wouldn't have this objectivity. For example, you'd be able to say that 5 + 5 = 7, and it would equal 7 because you invented it. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how much you say 5 + 5 = 7, even if you were to suddenly convince the entire human population that 5 + 5 = 7, I'm never going to hold up 5 fingers, and then suddenly have like this many fingers up. That's not how mathematics works. So this is ultimately, at the end of the day, is the point that is the fatal flaw of the entire negative case, this idea of objectivity, that mathematics has this sort of objectivity. No matter what you want to believe about it, it's still going to have a set true and a set false. So let's go back to the question that was presented at the beginning of my opponent's case. If there were no sentient beings, would mathematics still exist? And the answer is a resolute yes. There would still be pens, or well, probably not pens, but objects flying through an air in a parabolic shape. There'd still be rainbows with that arc. You'd still have 2 and 2 = 4. Nothing about that would change. So because of these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot, because math ultimately must be discovered and not invented.
All right, I've got 4 minutes. It'll be the framework debate, affirmative case, negative case. Can I get a thumbs up when everyone is ready? All right. We both have similar definitions of invent and discover, which leads to the thought experiment. If sentient beings aren't here, would mathematics still exist? The mathematics as we have it now. Now, this naturally prompts the question of what is mathematics? Note that their definition issue about how Oxford and all of them define it as a science still begs the question of what a science is. If you look at the American Heritage Dictionary definition of science, it's the observation, identification, description, experimental investigation, and theoretical explanation of phenomena. Note the distinction there. Phenomena is distinct from our study of the phenomena. In other words, mathematics is distinct from physical reality itself. This is an important yet crucial distinction, because either way you cut the definitions debate, it comes down to this fundamental issue, and it's elaborated on by the contentions. Also, an important thing to note on the definitions issue, assuming that this debate gets muddled in the future, the best way to evaluate this round is the standard of most mathematics, or the propensity of evidence. In other words, to prove a general statement like mathematics was discovered, not invented, true or false, we have to look at the majority of mathematics, not individual examples or particular branches. On the contention 1 about independence, they talk about these principles, such as 5 + 5 = 10, but 2 issues. First is that human awareness defines these principles. First, I'm not just saying like the linguistic principle of what the term equals means. I mean the actual syntactic meaning of equals, of equality. There is no meaning of that in the universe without human or at least sentient awareness there. And without that, those base principles make no sense. But second is a fundamental issue my opponent hasn't addressed in their last speech, which is that humans can invent new logics and new principles, such as 1 + 1 = 1. Through the invention of the transistor, we've created fundamentally new principles and fundamental new trees of mathematics. They claim no one person invented math. Well, that's trivially true, but collective humanity is mathematics' sole originator. Furthermore, even if you buy this whole point about principles, keep in mind that this is a small sect of mathematics. Greater than 99%. The bulk, the majority, is the extrapolations we draw from those principles, the models we create to try to explain and approximate reality. And under that standard, the ballot has to go to the negative because those are approximations. The contention 2 about language. Keep in mind, this relies on the definition of mathematics being whatever the affirmative says it is. But the second concern is that I'm not claiming math is about language. Like obviously a 1 in English or I don't know, an Eins in German, they all mean the same thing. However, math is about models, because models are the only thing we have to understand mathematics. There's a couple of reasons for this. First is intuition. Do you think of Newton's equations as math? Well, if you do, you align with pretty much everyone else on Earth. And that means you align with the negatives interpretation that mathematics is our models, and those are approximations. Second is that this resolution is mathematics was discovered, not invented, meaning we're debating a past tense form of mathematics, not some ideal future sense of what it could be. This leads into the third objection, which is that it's unfair to presume that mathematics is this ideal something out there when we have no evidence of that. Physicists have been searching for a theory of everything for the past several centuries, and they still haven't found it, which seems to indicate that mathematics can't be the sole arbitrator of everything, but our models work in certain respective contexts. On the contention 3 now about further exploration. As Crossx should have made clear, this relies on the assumption that mathematics is this ideal sense out there. However, proof gives us new information, and it requires human origination and ingenuity, which is a form of invention. Going to the negative case now. On the contention about approximations, they claim models are an invention. Keep in mind, they agree here, models are inventions, but models are mathematics. They're the only things we have. Extend across the arguments made on the affirmative case. They talk about moon versus models, but there's a clear distinction here. The moon is physical. Mathematics is not physical. You can't verify mathematics as you can by looking up at the moon through a telescope. You verify it through predictions. And the fact is that our predictions that mathematics draws are disconnected from reality. That's reason to believe we've invented it. Now, onto the contention 2 about awareness. They claim naming a bird is different, but I'm not talking about names as in linguistics. I'm talking about naming as in terms of fundamental relations such as equality. And keep in mind, they haven't addressed the point about context, which means entire new trees of mathematics are invented. And in the modern age, that is the bulk of math.
Okay, and Crossfire, is my opponent ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, you have the first question again.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is kind of about the last thing that you were just talking about. You keep talking about how like the bulk of mathematics now is these invented concepts, these new invented like branches of mathematics. Can you give some examples of what you would consider those branches to be then?
Yeah, sure. So we can start with the clear example about gravity, or the applications of mathematics to really any physical thing out there. A second example would be computational theory, as in the algorithms that run on this computer in front of us. A third example would be more abstract issues like set theory, which require human awareness to define what sets or orders or magnitude mean.
Okay. Would you like the next question?
Sure. When you mention mathematics is not a language, could you elaborate on what you mean by language? Because you also mentioned that it's not models either.
So what I'm talking about here is there's a clear distinction between the mathematical symbols, the models, the language, and what mathematics actually is. The example that I give is 5 plus 5. You could represent 5 plus 5 in so many ways. A graph, a matrix, an equation, a diagram. You could write it in Roman numerals. You could write it in Arabic numerals. You can show it on your own hands. So these are the different things that you keep defining mathematics as, but they're not what true mathematics is. The true mathematics underlying this is the idea that 5 plus 5 equals 10, not any way that we choose to represent it, not the numbers that we write down, but the actual idea itself. So this is the whole Lakoff and Nunes card that I read earlier, that mathematics is about more than these symbols, more than these representations. Mathematics is the fact that when I say 5 plus 5 equals 10, even though I'm saying these words that we've invented, that actual concept underlying it means that 5 plus 5 will never equal 7 or 3 or 4, regardless of whether or not you believe in it.
So I don't dispute that, language can be different, like German and English, they can represent the same concepts. But my question is, where does the concept of equality or summing or subtracting or multiplication or exponentiation arise from the universe if we don't have humans to define the process, not just linguistically, but in terms of what the process actually is?
Well, we can look to pretty much anywhere in the natural world. For example, if you have a tree that has 2 apples on one branch and 2 apples on the other branch, it's not suddenly going to be like not 4 apples in total. If we're even looking to the example of the Fibonacci sequence that you can see everywhere in the world, for example, like the example of sunflowers. Sunflowers, their seeds tend to follow that Fibonacci sequence of 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 5. When we're looking at these examples in the real world, the fact that these will still continue existing, regardless of whether or not there's a sentient being to name them or call that addition, they'll still be there. Those groupings will still exist. You'll still have 2 apples and 2 apples being 4 apples, regardless of whether or not there's someone to name what that actually means.
Can I have a follow-up there? Who defines where the set ends? As in, who defines where the tree ends? Why are we looking at one tree in particular instead of several trees, or 2 branches in particular instead of several branches? Who is doing the asking?
That's the exact same thing as like sort of any language. It's like, who's defining what these words mean? So of course we're defining what those words mean, but the actual substance itself, you could say that's like, maybe the thing that you're looking at is instead like the entire tree. That's time, but may I still continue? Is everyone good with me continuing? Okay, I'll finish up my answer then. So like, but the idea of like, regardless of whether or not there's a human there, that's not going to change the fact that suddenly those 2 apples and those 2 apples are going to equal 5 apples or 6 apples or 7 apples. The fact of the matter is like, you'll still, even when you're going to the very smallest degree of say an atom, there's going to be certain numbers of protons that each atom has. That's not going to change regardless of whether or not someone's there to observe that. Okay, and then I'll be using some running prep starting now. Okay, that's about 1 minute and 30 used. And then for a brief off-time roadmap, since this is the consolidation speech, it's not going to be like strict line by line. It's going to be more a grouping of the larger ideas of this round. If everyone is ready, then time will start now. So the first thing that we're going to start with, again, is the sort of framework debate, because the idea of like this resolution is you need to know what mathematics really is in order for you to actually debate it. So when we're looking to the definition of mathematics, my opponent agreed last time that mathematics is a science. But when we're looking to the definition of science from Cambridge Dictionary defines science as knowledge. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines science as knowledge. And so does Oxford Dictionary as something that we're studying about gaining of this knowledge. So think about what the idea of what knowledge is. Knowledge are these sort of facts. They're not something that you just invent or create, or else you could say that 5 plus 5 equals 7, and suddenly that would be true. So when we're looking at mathematics, we're looking at it as a system of these sort of facts that we observe throughout the world. So no matter what model or symbol you're using for it, that doesn't really change the underlying principle. It's like the idea of when we first discovered a red-winged blackbird, we invented the name red-winged blackbird, but we didn't invent the bird itself. Now moving on to the sort of larger concepts of this round. The first one is going to be this idea of this distinction between math as those concepts and those principles and mathematical models themselves. My opponent says that math is models. That's all that math is. But that's clearly false. For the example of like, say, when we're modeling gravity, we model gravity with an equation of VIT plus 1/2 AT squared. It really doesn't matter that we wrote it like that we chose to use those symbols. That's not going to change the fact that whenever I drop this pen, it's going to go down and not suddenly up or sideways or to the left. The fact of the matter is that's the mathematical principle behind that equation. We might have created that equation, that way of modeling it, of VIT plus 1/2 AT squared, but the actual mathematical concept itself is the idea that regardless of whether or not there's someone there to to observe it, someone there to be aware of it. This pen, when I drop it, is going to go down. It's going to, because of gravity, it's going to go down. So this idea of these things that we observe in the real world, that's what mathematics is based off. It's the fact that I can look out my window, see a rainbow, and see that curve. The fact of the matter is that I didn't invent that like rainbows are suddenly going to follow a parabolic path. It was something that's just already there. It's something that we discovered, that we came across. This is the idea with literally anything else in mathematics. Even though we might extrapolate more and more information based off of this, when we're going to the very, very beginnings of math, we're finding that it was discovered. It were these things that we discovered. It's the idea that if I hold up 5 fingers and I hold up my other 5 fingers, I'm discovering this. I'm not inventing that suddenly there's going to be 10 fingers. Now, moving on to the next major area of contention for this round is going to be this idea of past discovery and such. This is my third contention that my opponent really didn't say much against. For the example of Fermat's last theorem, the a to the n plus b to the n never equaling c to the n, Fermat didn't invent that, because if Fermat had invented it, then you would say that a to the n plus b to the n never equals c to the n because Fermat said so. When Andrew Wiles came along and proved that true, he didn't add anything tangible to the original theorem. Nothing was added. Invention by definition means the creation of something new. Andrew Wiles created nothing new. He only found supplemental knowledge. He discovered more about it. When we look to examples like this, it's clear that mathematics must therefore be discovered. My opponent said that in his own last speech that physicists have been searching for a theory of everything. Why would they be searching if it wasn't out there? Why would they be looking for something if they invent it? Or else they would just invent their theory of everything and be done with it. But the fact that physicists even are searching means that this is something outside there. This is something my opponent said himself. And for these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
I've got 3 minutes consolidation speech. I won't be down the flow necessarily, but disagreements. Is everyone ready? Judges, let's start first on where we agree. The question to ask yourself when evaluating this round is, if sentient beings aren't here, would our mathematics still exist? Now, naturally, this prompts the question of what is mathematics, and herein lies the first disagreement between the affirmative and the negative. What is math? There's a couple of ways to evaluate this debate. First, you could look at the strict definition of mathematics. Now, if you look at the definitions provided by the negative, study is something that happens only within humans. Even if you look to the affirmative definition and then look at the definition of science, you can keep in mind that science requires human interpretation there too. For instance, biology is not nature. Biology is our study of nature, and it's very similar with mathematics. In other words, organisms obviously exist, but Punnett squares or the trees we create out of those organisms, those are invented because we try to represent those organisms. It's very similar with mathematics. Now, my opponent is abstracting away to say math is science, science is knowledge, but notice how you lose information at every stage of abstraction. That is a bad standard for evaluating this debate. Furthermore, keep in mind, my opponent still has not responded to the issue that if you focus on math being idealistic concepts, you ignore the fact that our current conceptual understanding of mathematics is what is at stake in this debate. There's several reasons for this view. First is intuition. Think of Newton's equations for calculus or gravity, or even Einstein's equations. Do you think of those as mathematics? Well, if so, you sit in line with pretty much everyone else on Earth. But those are models. Those are mathematics. And we've agreed that those models are invented. Those are the bulk of mathematics because they're what we use to describe the physical world. Next is the issue of the strict vernacular of the resolution. It utilizes the term mathematics was discovered, not invented, indicating we're not debating some idealistic sense of what math could be or will be in the future. We're debating what it has been and what it is right now. That is not idealistic. That is models. It is not fully conceptual understanding. Third and finally on this what is math point, please keep in mind that we're debating most mathematics, since if this debate does get muddled, it comes down to what is the bulk of mathematics. That leads to the second disagreement, which is these core principles. I would argue it takes human awareness to even define principles. I'm not saying linguistically, one is different if it's said in German or if it's said in English. I agree with my opponent there. But my opponent is equivocating linguistics with syntactics. In other words, the idea of equality or the idea of plus or adding or subtracting or exponentiation, those have no meaning in the universe without human awareness. Not just the name we assign to that operation, but the operation itself. But even if you don't buy this argument, two things to keep in mind. This is far from the bulk of mathematics. Greater than 99% is the extrapolations we draw from it. And second, and most importantly, the round-ending argument that my opponent has dropped is the issue that we can make new context, as in other words, create new principles. With the creation of the transistor, we created the new principle of 1 + 1 = 1. The third and final disagreement is extrapolations. This is the bulk of mathematics, and this bulk is explained only through models. If you think of Newton or Einstein's equations as mathematics, then you think of them as approximations, you think of them as representations, and therefore not real.
Okay, and then I'll be using the remainder of my prep time, which is about 1 minute and 30 seconds, starting now. Okay, and then for a brief off-time roadmap, since this is the last speech, I'll just be going over the voters of this round. If everyone is ready, then time, start now. So starting off again with the question that we've been kind of arguing this whole time, what is mathematics? And my opponent keeps saying that mathematics is this human conception of it. It's the fact that like when we create these ideas of what plus is, what equals is, that's the true mathematics. But the affirmative is posing that mathematics isn't that. When we're looking to the definitions of what mathematics is, it's defined as knowledge that we observe from the natural world. We're seeing that we don't just invent knowledge. We don't just suddenly decide, okay, now I know that 5 + 5 = 7. No, we discover knowledge. We discover that 5 + 5 = 10. It's this idea of objectivity that makes mathematics not an invention. We look to even the example of biology. My opponent says that biology is just an invention. But when we're looking to this idea, sure, those taxidermical things, those are inventions. This idea of when we come across a bird, naming it a red-winged blackbird, that's the invention, but the bird itself was not an invention. So we're looking to this idea that still that bird itself is not an invention. Likewise, mathematics in this case is similar to that bird. Mathematics are these principles. It's the fact that when I drop this pen, it's never going to go up. It's never going to go sideways. It's going to go down. The fact that these concepts exist means that mathematics therefore must be discovered. We look to the example of the Lakoff and Nunes card I read in my second contention. These are two professors of linguistics, and they specifically specify that mathematics is about these underlying concepts. It's not about our representations of it. It's not about the models. It's about the underlying concepts themselves. Now, moving on to the next reason why you need to be voting for the affirmative. And this is going to be the idea of what the definition of invent is. The definition of invent is to create something new, to create something that has never been before. But when we're looking to the actual examples of mathematics, of the mathematical world, nothing is ever really being created. We're creating models and we're creating ways of representing it, but the actual underlying principles aren't created. Those are things that have always been there. Even with the example of transistors that my opponent talks about, how we invented that 1 + 1 = 1, but the way that actually works, like transistors and the idea of 1 + 1 = 1 works, is through complex numbers. It's through this idea of imaginary numbers that are called lateral numbers, because they're things that we're able to conceive of in non-Euclidean geometry, which is actually our world, because our world isn't a two-dimensional space. So that idea is still something that derives itself from the real world. It's actually the exact thing that I was talking about in my third contention. What Riemann's greatest discovery was this idea of non-Euclidean geometry. So this thing is still a discovery. It's a way that we've learned more about the world. Riemann didn't invent anything. Riemann simply discovered something. Einstein discovered more. And the fact that black holes proved both of them true shows that it wasn't something they just invented. It was something they discovered about the world around us. So when we're looking to any of these things, we see that mathematics ultimately isn't this creation of anything new. It's always, always, always derived from the real world. We're looking to this idea of objectivity. And this objectivity will still be the fatal flaw of the negative side, because the idea that we create anything, that we invent anything, means that we have control over that. But the idea that we will never have 5 + 5 = 7, in the fact that I will never hold up my 5 fingers, my other 5 fingers, and get suddenly this many fingers, that's what mathematics truly is. So the question is, if sentient beings here, would mathematics still exist? And I say it would, because you would still have things falling because of gravity, you'd still have sunflower seeds following the Fibonacci sequence, and you'd still have rainbows in a parabola. And for these reasons, I strongly urge for an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
All right, it'll just be voters. I get a thumbs up when everyone is ready. We both have similar enough definitions of invent and discover to warrant the agreed upon question of if sentient beings aren't here, would our mathematics still exist? Now, of course, this prompts the question of what is mathematics, so let's break that down. To quickly summarize the affirmative position, it is that mathematics is these ideal concepts out there that are going to exist even if humans aren't here. However, there's several concerns that are still unresponded to by the affirmative even in their last speech. The first is the specific language of the resolution. If you look, its mathematics was discovered, not invented, indicating we're debating our current/past understanding of mathematics, not some ideal sense of what it could be or will be in the future. In other words, this ideal concepts points breaks down once you examine the specific resolution. Second is that it's unfair to presume that mathematics is all about these ideal principles when our past 10,000 years of human history have indicated we still don't have a complete understanding of mathematics. In fact, it's not even complete understanding. That's a bad way to phrase it. Really, we have a fallacious understanding to the extent that mathematics is merely a representation, an approximation of reality. The third and final issue is that the abstraction point about math is science, science is knowledge is a very bad standard because you lose value and information every time you abstract out away from the definition. But the real kicker here is a simple question you should ask yourself when filling out the ballot. Do you believe that Newton's equations for calculus or gravity, or Einstein's equations for relativity, or Kepler's equations for celestial mechanics, do you believe those are mathematics? Because if so, you align with everyone else on Earth. And that justifies a negative ballot, because those are models. And as we've both agreed, models are fundamentally invented. Final thing to note on this what is math point, we are debating about the bulk of mathematics, so let's break down what this bulk could be. First issue is going to be extrapolations. Here is the second voter. Keep in mind this is all of physics, and as a result, this is greater than 99% of all of mathematics. My opponent brings up this claim about objectivity, but really, math isn't objective when you look at the approximations issue. Like, take Einstein's theory of relativity. It's the best we have for describing gravity. And it gets close. It really does. 1 part in 100 billion. But notice that this is still not accurate, indicating that it's separate from reality itself. It's an additional layer of complexity we humans have added to try to understand and represent gravity. So of course, if humans aren't here, a potato will still fall to the ground. But our understanding of why that potato would fall, which is our mathematics, would not be here. The third and final voter is going to be about principles. This is the only affirmative offense available, and there's an equivocation going on between linguistic issues and the actual meaning of stuff like equality or adding or summation. They come up with this new response about how transistors are just coming out from imaginary numbers. But even if you buy this point, which is a new response, it doesn't respond to the core point that we invented the transistor, which enabled the new mathematics. If humans aren't here, the transistor isn't here, and thus every computational algorithm isn't here. As a result, even base principles are invented too.
So much. That was such a great round. Oh my goodness, you're such a good speaker, and thank you so much to all of our judges for your time.
Yeah, that was a great round. Thank you, and thank you to the judges.
Now, let's meet the two contestants for the final round of Big Questions Debate, sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. On the affirmative, code 47, Danju Liu from Hillscrest High School in Utah, coached by Ronald Hill. And on the negative, code 39, Patel from Mountain Home High School in Idaho, coached by Robin Christensen. It's my pleasure to congratulate these two students on their Big Questions Debate final round.
Now, congratulations to the finalists of Big Questions Debate, a debate format supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. This year's students have grappled with the complex worldview questions as they debate both sides of the topic resolved. Mathematics was discovered, not invented. Tournaments and classrooms that hold Big Questions debates are eligible to receive thousands of dollars per event. Thanks to the generosity of the Templeton Foundation, the NSDA has given almost $1.5 million to speech and debate programs across the country since 2016. We're excited that the foundation will generously support Big Questions for another year, creating continued opportunities for students to debate topics at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. You can host a Big Questions event at your tournament, at a school scrimmage, or even a classroom event. Please visit nsdabigquestions.org. That's nsdabigquestions.org. And there you'll find out more about how to do that. Your winners from the 50 teams competing at the 2021 Big Questions Debate. Semi-finalist in fourth place and receiving a $1,250 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation. Archon Sen from Egan High School in Minnesota, coached by Christopher McDonald. A semifinalist in third place, receiving a $1,250 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation. Greenlee Crow from Fayetteville High School in Arkansas, coached by Samantha Johnson. And placing second and receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation is the affirmative Danju Lee from Hillscrest High School in Utah, coached by Ronald Hill, and your champion receiving a $5,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation and winning on a 5-4 decision is the negative Patel from Mountain Home High School in Idaho, coached by Robin Christensen.